All right, well, welcome everybody to our Luke Easter SABR chapter and Rochester Baseball Historical Society meeting tonight. Very pleased to have Phil Dixon and Scott Simkus joining us to talk about Negro League Baseball, specifically Major League Baseball's decision to count the Negro Leagues as major leagues and kind of what some of the ramifications of that may be. And I'm sure we'll also get into our chapter namesake, Luke Easter, a little bit, and kind of go from there. We're not an overly large group today, so I think we can keep it fairly open as far as microphones go. If you have a question you want, you can pretty much jump in when you find appropriate. By introduction, Phil Dixon is one of the leading Negro League researchers in the world. He's been writing books and researching the Negro Leagues for probably close to 4 decades now, I believe. He's a Casey Award winner, and thrilled to have him here with us. And Scott Simkus has been also researching Negro League baseball and outsider baseball in general, which I'm sure he'll tell us more about that tonight. And he's also been heavily involved with the Seamheads database, and he'll be able to provide some insight into some of the statistical records of the Negro League and how that'll come into play with Major League Baseball's decision. So to get us kicked off, Phil or Scott, if you guys want to jump in and kind of talk a little bit about what was behind Major League Baseball's decision to include the Negro Leagues.
Hey, sure, thanks, Phil. Hey, first of all, thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it. I appreciate y'all reaching out. So, well, how did this happen? Man, I don't know, but it's pretty amazing. I really think it's 50 years of hard work by guys like Phil Dixon and John Howay and Bob Peterson. Everything that's happening right now has really been built on the shoulders of all of these really talented and passionate researchers and writers. And without the work that goes back 50 years, this wouldn't be happening today. So, I've been involved with Seamheads for about 10 years. I think my first big project was working for the Stratomatic game company out of New York back in '09. They wanted to create a Negro League set based on, the best 7 years of, let's say, about the top 100 players. So that was the first project that I worked on. And in the process of working on that, I made a lot of friends from SABR. I met a guy named Gary Ashwill and Kevin Johnson and Mike Lynch and a number of other folks who were working on similar stuff. And so we would exchange information and little tips and little leads on and help each other out. And so that's how I got involved with the Seamheads. And I think, honestly, it was really, we were never lobbying for this to occur. What we wanted to do was just simply record as much of the history as it occurred. And, I think it caught the attention of folks. We've had the data posted online for about 10 years. It started with just a handful of seasons, and every year we were adding a couple more years or a couple more games. And I think, last year was, awful in a lot of ways, with the social unrest and with the baseball season being delayed and people getting sick and dying. And I think that Major League Baseball felt like perhaps it was time to kind of reevaluate the legacy of the Negro Leagues and how that related to the Major Leagues. And, I started having some conversations with John Thorne privately. There was a big article that was published in The Ringer by Ben Lindbergh, which kind of sparked a national conversation about whether or not this should happen. And it really wasn't until the day before the announcement was made that I knew for sure that Major League Baseball was going to make this announcement. And certainly it was met with both praise and criticism. And I'll be honest with you, I think some of the criticism is justified. And on the other hand, I mean, ultimately, I think they're doing the right thing, but it's a complex issue. And I guess we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along this evening.
Yeah, I'll jump in at that point. I have been, actually looking at the statistics probably since maybe about 1982. And one of the things I realized early on is that, John Hallway's around. He was probably the one using the most statistics at that time. He would come up with, somebody was a 350 lifetime hitter and stuff. And he would have that information, but I knew it was all bad. I knew it was bad information. If you ever read one of my books, you will never see a lifetime batting average. The only batting average you might see, like maybe if they played like what they call the Color World Series and it's 10 games, I have all 10 games, I would put the statistics and I could say what he batted. But, I know that there was a problem from the very beginning. And so that's one of my concerns is today, because I still see a lot of problems. One of the problems Hallway had from way back, and I challenged him on this, was that he was compiling box scores without at-bats. And so he would guess at the at-bats. So I gave Hallway a little simple test. I said, let me provide you with some box scores, and I'll take the at-bats out, and you see if you can compile it back together accurately. Of course, he couldn't do that. And so he was just guessing at the at-bats, which meant that if you don't have the at-bats, then you can guess at it, but it's never going to be accurate. And so I also felt like there was too much of a push to try to make Negro League baseball like Major League Baseball. And so people would be talking different things about batting averages, someone leading the league, and things like that, which never existed. It really wasn't the history. And so what I try to do is approach it in a different way. And I feel like there's a better way to do statistics that don't steal from the players. And then also one of the things I don't like about the Major League approach to it is they're taking 7 seasons and they're starting in 1920. Basically, they're segregating any baseball player who played before 1920 out. And so basically those statistics that they're using, they're going to get smaller and smaller. And one other thing too, I learned this from experience. I used to do statistics for the Kansas City Royals. So I would sit in the booth and watch Major League Baseball games. And I would see people maybe at the first month of the season, maybe they've got 25 games and they might be batting 350, 360. But then over the course of a full season, that guy might be a 250 hitter. And so I realized that the small number of games can skew the results a lot. So over the years, I tried to approach this very cautiously and knowing what information was there, what was not there. And so, I've got a lot of concerns, but especially the fact that Major League Baseball jumped out there and I felt like they didn't do enough discovery on this. And I think they were trying so hard to benefit Major League Baseball, to benefit off of the Black Lives Matter movement and social conditions of the time, that they made this announcement prematurely. And I think that matter of fact, I know there's some better ways to do this. And so I'm kind of a baseball purist, and I'm a Negro League fanatic. So you got a couple of things in my head, and it's going to skew the numbers in a way that is going to change a lot of things. And I don't know if it helps baseball history. I get the feeling it doesn't, but it definitely waters down the Negro League story. Also, I might mention that when it originally came out, they said they were going to include maybe 30, I think it was 3,200 Negro Leaguers in this statistic. And there's no way that that's going to happen, because if you take the Negro National League, 1920, you got 8 teams. Say if you expand the roster out to maybe 16 players, and so now you have 8 teams times 160. Well, actually, we say 100. Let's say you've got 10 teams, and we'll round it off. You get 16 players, so you got 116 players, right? Well, you take that 160, excuse me. But if you take that 160 multiplied by 7 leagues, and with 10 teams, you still don't get 3,200. So even their first announcement was skewed. So that's the kind of position. So I would like to see something really well done. And only other thing I might add is being a person who came through the 1960s, I saw integration firsthand, experienced it, lived it. And one of the things I noticed is that there was no structure to the integration. So you get 50 years down the road and people want to ask, was this integration, was it the best move? How was it not orchestrated correctly, et cetera, et cetera. And I get the feeling that the baseball statistics are a new integration. And if we don't do it right, we're going to get 50 years down the road, 50, 60, a generation down the road, and we're going to have disastrous results related to the history. So that's my end on this question.
Yeah. And I know one thing that you mentioned, Phil, was that the record keeping and like season leaders weren't necessarily recognized by Negro Leagues like they were for Major League Baseball. Could you guys talk a little bit about the challenges and differences in trying to convert Negro Leagues and the way they kept records to Major League Baseball and the way they kept records?
Sure. I'll start. I happen to think researching Negro League baseball is probably, and maybe I'm biased, I think it's the most difficult baseball research that one can do. It's very, very challenging. They didn't have a centralized stat bureau. They couldn't afford to do that. The schedule sort of fluctuated midstream, depending on where you could get a better crowd. And so, what you end up with is you are looking for needles in a haystack. I know I rebuilt the 1943 season, and in the Major League Baseball, you played most of your games in 10 major cities. In 1943, there were Negro League games played in at least 71 different cities. And I know that we haven't found every single game yet, but we've got games in Canada and in Dallas, Texas, and games that occurred in, of course, Birmingham and Atlanta. But just scattered all over the country, big towns and small towns. So a lot of those box scores that were played in neutral site cities, you're not going to find the coverage necessarily in the Pittsburgh Courier or the Chicago Defender. You really need to go to the local papers, and not everything's been digitized. Quite a bit every day you see more and more digitized, but you still have to get the microfilm. You still have to go through interlibrary loan to get papers. So that's one of the biggest challenges, just simply finding the games. And it can be, you're looking for a clue that was mentioned in the game story that said, hey, 2 days ago they played in Erie, Pennsylvania. The Monarchs won. And so now you got to contact the Historical Society in Erie, Pennsylvania, or a friendly librarian, and try to track down those games. And then, as Phil alluded to, there's a lot of problems with the box scores. That the most common, and there's certain cities that were, Philadelphia is one of them, where they didn't necessarily have the at bats or the bottom of the box scores. So, your first thing is you're trying to find a couple different accounts. You're trying to find multiple accounts for the same game, so that you can sort of fill in the gaps as best as possible. I think one of the things that's helpful now in 2021 is the emergence and the understanding of sabermetrics, so that even if you have a box score that ultimately doesn't have at bats, you can use algorithms to pinpoint it with a certain degree of accuracy. It's never going to be 100%. Now, I know I'm friends with John Holloway, as you are, Phil, and I know that the techniques that he was using back in the 70s and 80s just wouldn't pass muster. He had a certain, and I love John, okay? He's a friend of mine, and he's been a mentor really since I was a teenager when I first wrote to him. But there were some of his methodology was a little bit sketchy, but without the work that he did, we'd have a tough time today. Especially his oral histories are very helpful. But Phil, you've been doing this longer than I have. What are the challenges that you see, man?
Well, one of them that I might mention, the Negro Baseball League, unlike the major leagues, was America's only truly professional barnstorming league. So they didn't just play league games in league cities. And when you get into the 1930s with the Negro American League or the Negro National League, you'll find that, quite often. I might mention one example. 1938, the Kansas City Monarchs, in the middle of the season, they go to Canada. And so they play the Chicago American Giants through Canada. They go through Minot, Moorhead, Minnesota, and then they work up through the Twin Cities, and they're going to Winnipeg, Saskatchewan area up in there. And guess what? Then they come back after 2 weeks. And do any of those games count? And they call them exhibition games. So when, say, they began to look at these games, how do they decide which were what the Negro League called exhibition games? And, you can go by their standard, or do you count all the games that were played that you find the box scores? There's issues like that, but I know even in Pittsburgh, one of the main cities. Now I haven't seen how they're compiling the statistics with the sabermetric, but I'd be willing to challenge anyone to give them some box scores with the at-bats and see if they can duplicate it and how often they can duplicate it. I just have a lot of problems with the statistics. But the statistics, as good as they are, they don't tell the true story of the Negro League baseball experience. So it's like having numbers, but no stories. And so without the stories, the statistics themselves. That's quite a difference from knowing the Negro League story. So things that concern me, but one of them, I say it again, to get 50 years down the road and then realize that this was a hard way to approach this. So I think a lot of more thought needs to go into this. And I just don't feel like they have enough of the minds at the table.
Yeah. If you guys were to take a guess, what percentage of Negro League games that are being considered Major League do you think we have records for now?
Oh, it depends on the decade. I think the 1920s, in excess of 90% of the games we have box scores for. In the 30s and 40s, it sort of varies year to year, but I think it's in excess of 70%. We've got quite a bit. And, I would disagree a little bit with Phil, well, a lot actually about what he's saying. And that's okay. It's okay to disagree, but, I know the team that's worked on this. One of the important things is that we're all using the same metrics to go through the box scores and use the same toolbox. And that's what's different. You've got a group of really talented folks that have worked on this. And we have tested this stuff. You could take the 27 Yankees. And I don't want to overblow how many games there are that do not have box scores. I think we're overstating things. There's a lot of most of them have full box scores. The pitching stuff, the pitching stats can be a little bit questionable. You don't necessarily know when somebody was pulled out in every game. There are a lot of challenges, but it's not as daunting as some might suggest. So we got quite a bit of the data. And I would stand by the toolbox that has been used to reconstruct this stuff. And I know John Thorne knows intimately the kind of work and the diligence that has been put into this. So I would absolutely defend the work of this team. And that's, like I said at the beginning, we were not lobbying Major League Baseball. We were trying to do the most accurate, and we would test this stuff. You could take the 27 Yankees and knock out the at-bats for 30 of their games and have us use the algorithms to go through it. And you're going to have something that's really, in excess of 96, 97% accurate. So I stand by the work, absolutely, and proud of it, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And it looks like, I believe Phil was having some connection issues, so hopefully he'll be able to rejoin us in a minute. But we'll stick with you, Scott, while he's away.
I'm back now.
There you are. Okay.
Hey, Phil.
It went off completely. Yeah, I'm kind of in a wait and see. I've always had a lot of statistics that I've compiled, And, you know, periodically, like for instance, I released some of them in the 1931 Homestead Braves book that I did on their entire season. I did one on the 1905 Philadelphia Giants, and I have about 10 more of those on my computer that I have not released. But the thing is, even those numbers that I found don't match anything what other people have found. So there's a problem there because I know what I had, and I just don't know. So anyway, these are some of the, and these are the things that probably continue to be discussed.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned the Homestead Grays there, Phil, which kind of leads into another topic I wanted to get into as to what you guys think about the leagues that were chosen and what are we missing by just including those leagues versus some other things.
Let me start. I want to agree with Phil that the most disappointing thing is the exclusion of the pre-1920 seasons. We are losing a large chunk of John Henry Lloyd's career and Smokey Joe Williams and Pete Hill. The list goes on and on. We're losing those careers, and I am hoping that they will be reconsidered at some point. I mean, the other thing, everybody is operating under the understanding that we're going to continue to find more games. We are going to make corrections. So this is not going to be chiseled in stone, that this is going to be an ongoing project. They may post data at baseballreference.com at some point this year, but the numbers are going to fluctuate. You know, I found an error that had been counted probably for 30 years of a game where Satchel Paige had been credited with a loss in Birmingham. And once we got to go through the Birmingham news and discover what had happened, he had actually gotten injured the first batter of the game and had been removed, and he should not have been credited with the loss. So we're, you know, part of what we do is actively looking to get it as accurate as we can. The other thing, I'm really big into the semi-pro games too. There's nobody that can research. I think Phil's work on the 05 Giants and the 31 Grays and the Buck O'Neill's rookie season in 38 is, you know, that's the history. That a huge chunk of their schedule was against the semi-pro teams, and I think that you know, one of the things that I have said prior to this was, you really got to fight like hell to not try to define the Negro Leagues the way we define the white major leagues. There was a lot of interleague play. There was a lot of games that were considered exhibitions. In our database, we've included every game that they played against each other, with the exception of maybe some of the spring stuff early in the year. So we've tried to include as many games as possible. I think if you start to, it would be impossible to actually figure out which games they counted in the standings and which ones they didn't. And so the decision was to include, whenever they played somebody and we've got a result and we've got a game story or box score, we're going to use it in the data. And you know, it's interesting. It's interesting. I'll put it that way. What was the question?
Let me jump in here.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
We were talking about which leagues they were choosing.
Oh, yeah.
How the selection of the leagues, did they get that right? And what are we missing?
Well, Scott bring up one thing that I hadn't discussed, but it's really important again, which is the games that were played not against black teams. So what the games that they're going to compile are pretty much the games just against other African American teams, right? And in some of those seasons, like for instance, the Philadelphia Giants, they might have only played 15 games out of 130 against other black teams. So if you were doing that statistic, you put Pete Hill in at maybe 8 or 9 box scores, when I can clearly show you the history of all the games that he played in a completely different manner other than the statistics with stories. And so by not telling the whole story, you're telling a fraction of the story. And I'm afraid that fraction takes more away from the glory of the players than it gives to them. I might also mention some great teams like the 1931 Homestead Grays, who happen to be my favorite team of all time. Well, they weren't in any of the 7 leagues that they chose. So this great team that had all these wonderful players, Judd Wilson was on there, and Oscar Charleston, Chippy Britton, Willie Foster, even Satchel Paige pitched 1 game. We can go on and on and on. Those statistics won't be part of this major league mix. I have a real problem with that. And, these are just a few of the examples that I discuss regularly. When people ask me, I try to be very honest about it, from my 40 years of dealing with this topic, and probably 40 years of dealing with statistics.
Yeah. We did have someone write in a question to say, there is probably a need to recognize uncertainty with these statistics. And, I'd even point out even white major leagues, their statistics from the early part of the 1900s are uncertain. Ty Cobb's hit total got updated in the 1990s.
Yeah, exactly. And they find RBIs for Lou Gehrig, and the hit total for Ty Cobb changes. Hack Wilson's RBIs in 1930 is up to 191. Let me say this about stats. I'm a little bit more forgiving that there's this something we call the encyclopedia distortion. That the fact that it's in the encyclopedia or it's at baseballreference.com, we kind of accept that stuff as the gospel. But listen, in 1876, they're throwing the ball underhand, and the pitching distance was different, and there was only white players in the league with a handful of exception. And we just take it at face value. It's a little lie that we tell ourselves that Cap Anson's performance is the same as Ted Williams or Willie Mays, and when in fact we know that it's not completely apples to apples. We know that there are inaccuracies. We know that that the major league stats themselves aren't 100%. There is no 100% accurate. So what you're doing is you're trying to fight like heck to get it as close to 100% as possible. And that's why I'm at least pleased that they're open to corrections and additions, and as we find more information, that will be added to the database.
I might also add, in my most recent book on the Dizzy and Daffy barnstorming tour, all my life I heard Dizzy was the last National League pitcher to win 30 games. But in my book, I proved that he didn't win 30 games. And how many of us have been hearing that all of our lives? And it wasn't anything that I came up with. I read it in a baseball book years ago. And all I did was resurrect it when I was writing the book, resurrect the old argument. But, so there's lots of things that need to be corrected. Recently I was working on a baseball player, and they said he got married in 1931 to his wife. Of course, I do research and nobody can find him. I don't think he was married at all. But I've found a lot of information that needs to be corrected over the years. But I just like going in. I think if you do a good job going in, you can feel pretty satisfied that you don't have to take back the information you made. So the reason I never used batting averages, because I knew they were going to change, and I never wanted to have to take back information that I wrote and say, well, it was wrong, here's the latest. So that was just my approach, my own personal approach.
And I know one thing that you mentioned, I think it might have been to the last question, Phil, was kind of got into the sample size issue and how looking at the statistical record for Negro League games can kind of undercount a lot of the Negro League players. Could you guys talk about that a little bit more?
Well,
Sure.
only thing I would mention is that, just having done major league statistics, my experience early on, and I used to keep statistics for the Kansas City Royals in 89 and 90. So I would sit and I would watch every play. But I tell you, when you have a small sample, 30, 40 games, does it really explain how good that player was? You know, if he didn't do well, like a good example would be Willard Brown when he went up to the St. Louis Browns in 1947. You know, he was off at the St. Louis Browns, but in the Negro League, the Puerto Rican Winter, the Winter League, he was a completely different player in the minor league. But if you take that little sample he had with the St. Louis Browns, it will never show you how good Willard Brown was.
You know, I would say if you're trying to evaluate Negro League players, I would look at the career stats and it'd start there. I mean, to Phil's point, a lot of the seasons are very short. We don't have the box scores for every single game. And even if we had every single box score, it would still be small sample sizes season to season. So when I would see guys at the Baseball Think Factory try to do some quantitative analysis based on a 1937 stat line from the Negro Leagues, I cringe a little bit just because the sample size is too small. So, you know, I think it's great that people are trying to do that stuff, but you got to expand it a little bit. So, I mean, the seasons were really unbalanced too. I mean, you're going to have some teams that played 100 games against African-American opponents, and you have others that would only play 40. That was just the nature of the beast. That's the reality. And even if we had every single box score and they all had the at-bats, you're still going to have some challenges that make it difficult for apples to apples comparison. But what do you do? Do you just give up and we just throw our hands in the air? No, we keep soldiering on and pushing. And I think it's important work that Phil's doing, and I'm proud of the team that I've been working with. So I think it's great.
And do you have any sense yet as to how the major league statistical records could change as a result of this?
Sure. Because the seasons were so short, we're not going to see anybody surpass Barry Bonds or Henry Aaron in terms of career home runs, not if we're just including Negro League games against African-American opponents. But I think there are actually, there's enough plate appearances for the stars, and I'm thinking of Josh and Oscar Charleston and some of these Hall of Famers that you will see them creep into the leaderboard for rate stats, for batting average, on base percentage, OPS. You will see, this is going to be crazy, you'll probably see Josh Gibson in the top 10 in batting average when they finally, I guess, integrate the numbers. And you'll see a number of others as well, probably Judd Wilson, and you're going to see a little bit of some changes in those top 10 lists. But when you talk about the counting stats, which really isn't, you're not going to see that volume with the Negro Leagues when you're playing 60, 70 games a season. So, but you will see stuff. I think pitching, you know, you're going to see an expanded stat line for Satchel Paige, his data. And I agree with Phil. We're not capturing, you can't include semi-pro games in the stats. I mean, not in the major leagues, but I think we should want to compile those, and we should want to have them in their own encyclopedia. I think it does paint, and I've rebuilt the stats for the 28 Homestead Grays, all of the games, 150 games plus against all opponents. I'm a big fan of that stuff, and I'm a big fan of Phil's work, but you can't include that data because the competition simply, it was two things. It wasn't as good as the Negro Leagues, but it was a hell of a lot better than people realize. These semi-pro teams are very good at the least the low minor league level. And then when you talk about the Brooklyn Bushwicks and the Logan Squares in Chicago, you're talking about teams that probably approach AAA. They had a lot of former or future major leaguers on their rosters. So we sort of give short shrift to the semi-pro games. There is some meaningful data that could be gleaned from compiling that stuff, but it's not going to meet the threshold of including them in the major league database. And that's just my opinion.
Yeah. That kind of leads us to another question that I then throw to Phil, where we had someone curious as to how players would get to the Negro Leagues. Was there a minor league system or any sort of, did any major Negro League teams have farm systems, or was it just kind of a free-for-all?
Well, free for all might not be the correct term, but there were organizations that were feeder teams. For instance, the Kansas City Monarchs in the 1920s got a lot of players from the Jefferson Union Giants. But it was just, there was a lot of baseball being played by African Americans in the 1920s, or any period you want to go to. And you had a lot of ex-qualified players who maybe played in the league. Maybe they just had good connections. And if you were a good ball player, they would get your name up there. And then the other thing is sometimes when the teams were barnstorming, I've even seen black guys, they would bring the black guy to play with the white team so they could see the guy and then they pick him up. Lefty Lamarck was one of the players who pitched for the Monarchs. Let's see, Schoolboy Johnny Taylor. You know, and some of these guys, they made their names on white teams and got to the Negro League. So there were a variety of different ways that you could get there. And yeah, that's an excellent question. And some of those teams are pretty good too. The Jefferson Union Giants, well, I can point out a couple of years they were awfully good as well. That none of that statistics would be used. So Cristobal Torrente is going to lose those.
You know, they also played against some of the Negro Southern League teams and some of the teams from Texas during spring trips. And I know I rebuilt the 33 season for our database. And I think the Crawfords played against the Monroe Monarchs or one of the other teams down there. And and Obi Lackey, who was a shortstop for the Monarchs, the Monroe Monarchs, you know, had a great series against the Crawfords. You know, he was like 6 for 9 and played pretty good at shortstop. And the Crawfords ran into some injury issues in the middle infield mid-season, and all of a sudden Obi Lackey, boom, he's up in Pittsburgh playing for him. And so my sense is that Oscar Charleston and whomever, you know, Jim Taylor was another really good one. They were taking notes, they were getting names, and they were getting phone numbers. And when some sort of a need arose, they had a database of guys they could call on. And so you see a lot of migration from the Negro Southern Leagues up into the Negro National League and the Eastern Colored League. A lot of movement. And in my mind, I sort of consider the Negro Southern League AAA for black baseball. And I hope that it's eventually recognized as well, and that we count those stats and include them. And I think Phil's right. Some of those teams were, frankly, some of them once in a while were better than the bottom feeders in the Negro Leagues in the North. And it's kind of fun to kind of look at that stuff and see how those teams fared against one another.
You know, I might also mention going back to how the statistics are going to change. Of course, most of the lifetime totals, they're not going to surpass any of the big leaguers with the big numbers, but it's the percentages, the pitching percentage, you know, batting percentages over, you know, for what would be the Negro Leagues lifetime. But if you start looking at the percentages, there's going to be a lot of changes in those percentage areas. Also, I might mention too, there's little things like, for instance, I was watching someone on, I think it was Twitter last night, and they had a baseball game. The Kansas City Monarchs were playing a night baseball game in 1930, and they said Major League Baseball's first night baseball game. And you know, I'm trying to digest how I'm going to look at that. And, you know, and these are some of the things that are coming up, and they're quite a bit different than some of the things that, you know, if you've been sitting around with baseball statistics for a long time. But you know, they phrased that way last night, and I had to look at it. I didn't retweet it. I've been looking at it, trying to digest how I feel about it.
Well, here's how I feel about that stuff. I think it's awesome because you're going to see how innovative the Negro Leagues were. And so now we're going to include it in the Major League conversation, and you're going to see that the Negro Leagues, they were playing interleague games, you know, decades before the Major Leagues considered it. They were playing night baseball on a regular basis 5 years before the Reds, you know, dipped their toes in the night base. You're going to see a lot of innovation in the Negro Leagues. And I think this is going to be a different way to celebrate it. You know, I see a question on the board about playing devil's advocate. What about keeping at the work, compiling their stats, but focus on celebrating their talents independent of MLB and merge stats? Isn't that what we've been doing for 50 years? You know, can we maybe take it to the next level and deal with the ramifications that people are going to have a tough time with this? You know,
Yeah,
tough. You know,
well,
it is time.
but the thing is, you know, like I look at it like the integration of America all over again. You know, the integration that I lived through schools and through work and all of that. And people still have a problem with it because the way it was handled, the way it was administered. And I get the feeling that if we don't do this correctly, we're going to get down the road and there's going to be a lot of questions. The big question is going to be, should we have done it at all? And to me, one thing I really kind of think of, I think baseball, Major League Baseball missed a golden opportunity because I kind of feel like this, you know, maybe Major League Baseball should have made themselves the home for all great players. You know, I've done work on the House of David. The House of David had some marvelous players. Doc Talley hit over 500 home runs. The Hall of Fame, they're not thinking about Doc Talley, but maybe they should be thinking about Doc Talley. You know, there were some great minor league baseball players. They'll never be enshrined in Cooperstown. And guess what? There's players from Japan, you know, Sahara O. You know, we've been hearing about these people all our life. If Major League Baseball wants to be the home for baseball, let's be the home for baseball for real, instead of just cherry picking a few Negro League statistics and saying we're doing a good job. I think that Major League Baseball is thinking kind of narrow. I would have loved to have seen them become more inclusive to some of these other great players that we know existed but get no recognition at all, and they're not all Black.
Yeah, great points, Phil. And actually, that leads perfectly into something I wanted to get to. This is, you know, probably the most general attention that's been paid to the Negro Leagues since the 2006 Hall of Fame elections. With what we've learned in the past 14 years since the group of Negro Leaguers were inducted into the Hall of Fame, how do we think they did in 2006? And you know, what have we learned, and what would we want to change going forward with that?
Well, in my estimation, they did a horrible job. They did a horrible job, and I've made that known. First of all, the way they picked the committee. Major League Baseball and through the Hall of Fame, they had given a grant. And so that grant was to do statistics on the Negro Leagues. And so people instantly put together teams. So John Holloway called me. He said, Phil, I'd like for you to be on my team. He said, no problem. And so then I get a call from Jim Riley. Jim Riley said, I'd like you to be on my team. So say, no problem. I'll be on your team too, Jim, whoever wins the contract. Well, of course, neither one of those guys won the contract. And so it went to some other guys, right? And so when it came time to elect players to the Hall of Fame, they took that same group. So there's no John Holloway, there's no Jim Riley, there's no Phil Dixon, but you had people who had never written a book, never done any research, sitting on the committee. And I even called after Robert Peterson, who had died. You know, Robert Peterson hadn't done anything in the hobby since 1969. And so when he died, I called them. I said, hey, look, I see he's not on the committee. I'd like to come in. And they said, well, he voted before he died. And then another guy quit the committee. I couldn't remember the reason right now. But when I called them on that, they said, well, we're not going to add another person to it. So basically, they had some problems going in. And then, for instance, if Buck O'Neil gets into the Hall of Fame, nobody complains. But when Buck O'Neil didn't get in, it made everyone suspicious of this activity. And so, but John Donaldson didn't get in either. And I had put a crew together. Matter of fact, Peter Gordon has gone and continued to run with it. But Peter Gordon was part of the team that I had, which was myself and Dave Kemp out of Sioux Falls, Pete Gordon, and another guy named Malinsky. We compiled, I think at that time, 4,200 strikeouts for John Donaldson. And they ended up putting pictures that they did not have the statistics to even get anywhere close. But their argument was, well, he didn't get these strikeouts outside the league. Now Pete's over 5,000 strikeouts. So there were some problems. And on the day of the event, I did cover it for a local cable TV station. And so I got a chance to see firsthand some of the reaction that people had. And it wasn't a beautiful day for baseball when Buck O'Neil didn't get in, especially out west where he was loved so much.
Yeah, I wasn't involved in any of that stuff other than as an observer. And, I think they blew it. Obviously, Buck O'Neil was a major oversight. I think John Beckwith should have been considered. I think Dick Lundy is another one that should be in the Hall of Fame. And there's probably another 24 that we could rattle off. Charles Smith. Nothing's going to be perfect. Let's hope they open the door. If you're a Hall of Fame guy, I think there's some other people that should be considered, and maybe Phil and I will be on the next committee, and we'll get some other guys in. We'll see what happens.
There's a few that I'd like to see in there too. Don't forget Bud Fowler.
Oh God, yeah, that's ridiculous, right? Yeah.
Let's see here.
Hey,
All right.
Phil, who else would you want to see in there? Who do you like that they've missed on besides Donaldson and
I like Chet Brewer. Chet Brewer.
Mm-hmm.
People talk about Buck O'Neil. I knew Buck very well. Buck was instrumental in me getting to the Royals, right? And but one thing that Chet Brewer does when Buck O'Neil, they talk about the players like Ernie Banks and Lou Brock, Lee Smith, those guys who got to the big league. But when you talk about Chet Brewer, who had a longer career in the Negro League, was a top pitcher. And how about this? He also played with a handicap. When Chet Brewer was 4 years old, his foot was partially decapitated by a trolley car in Leavenworth, Kansas. He pitched his entire career with 2 toes on the foot you step down with to pitch. Handicap. Most people didn't know that. I stayed at Chet Brewer's house and he had told me this story a lot of times. So I said, Chet, show me the foot. So he showed me his foot. I can say I've seen his foot. Anyway, long story short, he pitched his entire career with a handicap. But after his career, he goes out to Los Angeles and he is responsible for finding people like Bobby Tolan, Roy White, Enos Cabello, Bob Watson, and hey, don't forget Doc Ellis, right? So Chet Brewer, at one time he had 8 guys on his team, the Chet Brewer's rookies, that go to the big leagues. And that's not to deflate anything that Buck O'Neil did, but hey, I think that's pretty good feat too, after a 20-year plus Negro League career. Also, he was the second Black manager in minor league baseball. How about that? So Chet Brewer is one that I really like. I got a chance to know him, and I can think of a few others too, pioneers. That Dan McClellan is another one. I think that needs recognition. Walter Ball, pitcher.
Yep.
That's another one.
What about Candy?
There's some great players out there. Yeah.
What about Candy Jim Taylor, Vic Harris? I mean,
what you say, Candy Jim, no doubt about it. Matter of fact, Candy Jim was, to me, let's see, Bean got in, right?
Yes, yeah, he did.
Yeah, I think Candy would have been better than Ben.
Yeah.
But, no one asked me, but
well, Ben might have been the better hitter, but Candy Jim, he's kind of like the Connie Mack of Black baseball. People don't realize this. He probably managed more games than anybody in the history of that league. Plus, he was a very good ball player. He had a long career. He basically stayed in the game until he passed away at a very young age in, I think, 1948. But when you look at the totality of what he did in terms of developing great players, the longevity of his career, the championships with the Homestead Grays during World War II. That he assumed the ranks when Vic Harris kind of stepped away for a little bit, and the Grays had lost to the Kansas City Monarchs in '42. So there was something to play for, and Candy Jim was the right guy at the right time with that team, and they just dominated. So he's a guy that I'd like to see in there.
Well, you just mentioned another person, Vic Harris.
Yes.
Vic Harris, manager of the Homestead Grays, played 1 year with the Pittsburgh Crawfords, was in '34, but he was a exceptional talent. Candy Jim probably developed more young talent than any man, certainly in the Negro Leagues. But yeah, definitely. And to be honest with you, even when they did the 2006 induction, I would have picked Frank Leland over Effa Manley any day of the week. I think
me
Frank
too.
was much more monumental. And sometimes, I've been known the guys to shoot pretty straight. So you guys gonna have to bear with me on some of this stuff. But when it came to Effa Manley, Effa Manley was the first person to sell, some players to the major leagues. And she essentially established the price tag that the Kansas City Monarchs, Sid Pollock, and all those had to work under, which was $5,000. But guys, how much did they sell Lefty Grove to the Philadelphia A's for in 1930? It was $100,000 plus a couple of players. So they're getting a fortune of players because Effa Manley sells the first one for $5,000. You're getting $1 million players. And, you're paying $5,000 for Ernie Banks. Come on, guys. And then you wonder why the Negro League went out of business. Come on, give me a break. And part of it was because of Effa Manley. And so I tell a different story, and I had a chance to talk to many people and interview people who knew Effa personally and played for her during the period when she was with the Newark Eagles. So that's my spin on Effa Manley.
Well, I agree with you. I think that was it was a little bit of political correctness or trying to make some sort of a big statement, and they really blew it. I would rather have had Buck O'Neill than Effa Manley. So we can't undo that. And I think when you were mentioning earlier about things you can't undo, the stats, Phil, I'm not so worried about because they're open to those being adjusted and improved and added to. But when you put a plaque on a wall at Cooperstown, you have blown it forever. And it's a shame. It's a shame. I didn't think they did a really good job in 05, 06 either. So we agree on that.
We're getting close to 8:30, and there's a couple quick things I wanted to hit on. First of those was, when do you think we'll next hear something from Major League Baseball on the Negro Leagues?
I would expect something in the next couple of months. I'm not in active conversations with them at this point. It's mostly Gary Ashwill and Kevin Johnson are in on those, and I've kind of moved on a little bit. I'm still helping them organize some of the data, but I'm not actively involved in the conversations. I know that we'll probably hear something in the next couple of months. I believe we're going to see the stats included at baseballreference.com this year. I don't know exactly what part of the year, but I think that's going to happen. I mean, they have stats there now, but that was the crappy work from 05. So when you look at stats at baseballreference.com, you're going to see data that was completed basically in 2004. It's like 16 years old, number one, and number two, because they had a 30-man team working on it. And I can talk crap about it. I wasn't part of that team. That there was a real inconsistency in the skill level of the researchers from year to year. And if you have a keen eye, you could sort of notice which years were well done and which ones weren't. But what you see at seam heads represents a tremendous amount of growth and a correction of a lot of that stuff. So yeah, I think you're going to hear news this year, probably this spring. I don't think it's imminent. I don't think we're going to hear anything in the next couple of weeks, but I think in the next couple of months, we'll probably hear whatever the next step is. And I don't know what they're thinking. I know that just from my position and the guys that have worked on the database with me, we just keep on plugging away and, just keep on looking for new games, looking for sort of new stats, new stuff to add to the database. And the work goes on the same way it has the past 12 years.
Great.
Yeah, I will mention, yeah, I'm not that closely associated with them at all. So I just continue to do the writing that I'm doing, working on some different projects. Like I said, my Dizzy Dean book that came out did very well. And so what's interesting about the Dizzy Dean book, guys, if you really think about it, how many black guys do you see writing about old white guys? So I'm kind of like a pioneer. I shouldn't be, but I love baseball, and so I studied the whole thing like most of you probably have, and I just love it. So I'm subject to write about anything, but I do have another book that's coming that's going to be dealing with another white player heavily involved with Negro Leagues. So yeah, but for me, the statistics aren't the most important thing. And I know right now that's the hot button, but it's always been for me the stories behind the numbers, the stories about the people, the stories of life on the road as a barnstormer. That's what it's always been for me, even though I love statistics. I appreciate them very much, but statistics don't always tell the story that people want to hear. And I did a 200 city tour from 2014 to 2018, and believe me, on night to night, I used so few statistics because people came, they wanted to hear stories. And so that's kind of what I'll continue to do. And so I'm going to be watching, but I will be watching with keen eyes on whatever happens. And I'll probably have plenty to say there, Scott. So bear with me.
That's okay, brother. Just reach out to me, man. I'm always here.
Yeah.
And
of course, our local chapter's namesake, Luke Easter, did spend some time in the Negro Leagues. Do you guys have any Negro League stories or stats from Luke Easter that you can share?
Yeah, I've got one. Luke Easter, 1938, the Kansas City Monarchs, things got so bad in St. Louis that the Kansas City Monarchs would skip over St. Louis from 1931 to 1938. They finally came back in 1938. Didn't play there for all those years. And so they come in and they play the Titanium Pigment Company. And Luke Easter is playing first base. And of course, that night, Doc Bracken beat the Kansas City Monarchs. Doc Bracken, I don't know if you ever heard of Doc Bracken. Let's just say this, in Branch Rickey's league that he started, I'm just drew a blank on the name. What was the name of the league? 1940, 45, 46. Oh, shucks. It'll come to me. But
Are you thinking of the Continental League?
No, it's the United States Baseball.
There we go.
bing, bing, bing.
Yeah, the Doc Bracken, to get Doc Bracken, they signed a whole team to get one person, and Doc Bracken. He was still a good pitcher all those years later. But just imagine, the Kansas City Monarchs come to St. Louis in 1938, and Luke Easter's playing. Just imagine that he started playing in the Negro Leagues in 1938. Just imagine the numbers that guy would have put up with what he did after age of 40. Just imagine what he would have been doing in 20 years earlier. It's just amazing. And he was a great ball player. I'm so proud to hear you guys name your chapter after him, because he was truly unforgettable. I still remember where I was the day, I guess it was 79 or 80, when I heard that he had gotten murdered. I was living in Colorado. I remember that day. So
The one in Indy is also named after Charleston. So Easter's not the only one with a chapter named after him within SABR.
Oh, there's a couple. Okay. Hey, I think Luke Easter is singular. And, Phil's touching on it, the fact that this guy did not play professionally until he was 31 years old, and that was with the Cincinnati Crescents, who were owned by Abe Saperstein, the Harlem Globetrotters guy. He's like Roy Hobbs. I mean, this is a guy that he did play a couple of games against Negro League teams in the late 30s. Phil touched on one of the games, but he was virtually unknown other than some of the guys he had played with, Sam Jethro and some of these guys. He would be in the Hall of Fame had he gotten on the radar in 37, 38, or 39. He would be in the Hall of Fame right now. Just an incredible talent. So he's singular in the sense that he didn't get a chance even in black baseball until he was 31, but he fits in with this larger group of kind of the lost boys. These are guys like, and some of them have been recognized and some of them haven't. I'm talking about Ray Dandridge, Art Pennington, guys whose careers just started at a certain point and they were at a certain age when integration happened. I think Sam Jethro is another guy that really is underappreciated because his career didn't start until he was in his early 30s. I mean, he was an incredible base stealer. And I think had he, it's a weird thing to say, had he been born 10 years earlier, that Sam Jethro would probably be in the Hall of Fame. But the fact that we got to see him at the end of his career in the majors, and he was starting to have, I guess, some troubles with his eyesight, which affected his defensive abilities. But he was still a very good hitter. He led the league in stolen bases twice. He had power for a center fielder. And, he's a guy that's underappreciated. Easter's underappreciated. Guys that didn't make the majors, like Art Pennington, are underappreciated just because of the timeline. And I think maybe this recognition is just another step towards recognizing them. So if you look for the positive, you're going to see Art Pennington. You're going to see a beefed up stat line for Easter. Oh, the other thing that's really interesting to me, and this isn't about Luke Easter necessarily, but it's kind of about his teammate Buck Leonard. So when Luke joined the Homestead Grays, Buck Leonard was pushing 40 years old, and Luke was 31. And you see how good Buck Leonard was. And I'm talking about the stats. You can see him at Seam Heads. And you get an appreciation because Buck put up bigger numbers that first year in a similar amount of games, hit more home runs, hit for a higher batting average. And it makes me appreciate how good Buck must have been, because he was, we know how good Easter was. And you see Buck was hanging with him those 2 years that they played together. And that's kind of fascinating to me.
All right.
Yeah, I might also mention, I'm going to say I must have mentioned St. Louis is probably one of the most underrated hotbeds for black baseball talent to come out of St. Louis. I'm telling you, you haven't heard the best of it yet. St. Louis had some awfully good players, and I was fortunate to get a chance. I knew Papa Bell very well. I knew Tweed Webb very well, and Matthew Dickey, who was over at the Boys and Girls Club, Matthew Dickey Boys and Girls Club. And when I would go to St. Louis, they would get all these players together. John Huntley used to come over, and Jesse Askew, and I got a chance to.
Uh-oh, I think Phil might be running into connection issues again.
It's a great baseball story, and at the same time, a sad baseball story as well.
Great. All right. Well, we're just after 8:30, so I think we can pretty much get to the point of wrapping up our formal program here. I did want to give each of you, though, a quick 30 seconds if you want to share how people can find you on social media or any projects of yours you'd like to highlight.
Sure. Well, I guess I'm most active on Twitter at this point. So it's at Scott Simkus. The last name is spelled S like Sam, I-M like Mary, K-U-S. So at Scott Simkus, I believe that's my handle. Let me double check. I post all baseball stuff there, and I'm pretty active. So it's at Scott_Simkus. You can find me on Twitter. And then, I wrote a book called Outsider Baseball, The Weird World of Hardball on the Fringe, which came out back in 2014. It was published by Chicago Review Press. It has sold out, but you can find inexpensive copies online, and it focuses on the intersection of Negro League baseball and the white semi-pros, which they were essential to each other's survival. That the semi-pro baseball wouldn't have been a big money industry without the African-American teams, which were huge draws. And the African-American teams probably wouldn't have been able to forge a living playing baseball without the semi-pros as competition. There was just epic battles with 10,000 plus people in the stands when the Bushwicks and the Bay Parkways and the Logan Squares and these teams played against the Negro League teams. So that's what my book's about. Phil?
Well, let's see. You can reach me on Twitter. Got an easy one to remember, guys. At Negro League Man on Twitter. And then I also have a web page. And on my web page, you can purchase some of my books. You want to know statistics? Here's some stuff that I've got, guys, with the stories on top of it. And you can get those at, it's at NLB, like Negro League Baseball. So it's NLBalive.com. And we're trying to keep the history alive. And I'm telling stories, but yeah, I'll slide in a few numbers every once in a while. But yeah, and so, you know, I'm just talking a lot of baseball, and guys, you know, I appreciate you having me on tonight and getting a chance to see most of your faces, right? And I just appreciate it. And it's been a wonderful conversation. And so thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, and Scott and Phil, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank
I
you, guys.
certainly can keep the room open as long as people are looking to hang out and chat for a little bit. Feel free to unmute yourselves. And anyone that has to go, including our guests, perfectly understand it. But again, thank you again so much for joining us. It was a great talk on Negro League Baseball.
Thank you.
And I will say our next chapter program is most likely going to be a book club. We're going to read The Cactus League by Emily Nemitz. It'll be our first novel that we're reading for book club. And if you're interested in that, let me know. And we'll work on getting a date for that works with those that are reading it.
Any questions before I jump off? We're good. Hey, thanks a lot for having me on. I really appreciate it, guys. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Scott. It was great to have you.
You take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Hope you had a good time. And in the absence of any other questions or comments, I think we'll close the room here in a second.
I think just as a kid who grew up in Rochester, rest in peace, Joe Alto. That was hard news to get. That was hard news to get. And I got his autograph in one of my books, and I've got the 71 team up on the wall. So
yeah, Mr. Baseball in Rochester for very good reasons.
yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Thank you for putting this together.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for joining us again, Ryan.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.